The comment wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It landed just as the projector warmed to Life's Soft Dry, perfectly timed to sound like strategy instead of dismissal. Quinn's been solid for a while, but I think it's time we brought in someone scalable. He said it with a half smile like he was pitching a new API instead of cutting out the man who built the original system. Nathan Cole, head of product, 32, all charm, all surface, and apparently the new voice in the room. Across the table, the CEO didn't even flinch, just nodded. Let's circle back on that in the Q3 discussion. I didn't speak, didn't blink. Just took another sip of black coffee and opened my notepad. But inside, something settled, like concrete. My name is Quinn Harris. I'm 50, Director of Engineering at Helixion Tech for now. And I've spent the last 9 years making sure this company didn't collapse under its own velocity. I built our internal infrastructure before we had funding, wrote the compliance playbook when legal didn't even have a full-time hire, stayed through layoffs, pivots in that brutal 2020 quarter where the server budget was a box of granola bars and duct tape. But today I was a relic in the corner chair. Nathan smirked as he clicked to the next slide. These projections assume we shift to a leaner, younger innovation team, more agile, less legacy dependent. I was the legacy, and the room knew it. They didn't say it, but they knew. It wasn't the first time someone like Nathan tried to paint me as excess weight, but it might be the last time they said it out loud without knowing who they were talking to. Because here's what no one in that room remembered. 5 years ago, when this company was on life support, 1 quarter away from defaulting on everything someone wired in capital from an anonymous holding group called Granite Arc LLC. That someone was me. Every cent my wife left me when she passed. Everything she told me to put somewhere, it would matter. I didn't do it for control. Didn't even take a board seat. Just 51% equity silent. No voting, no ego, no title. Just one clause in the purchase agreement. In the event of executive restructuring, any material change to founding systems or core infrastructure must receive approval from primary equity holder. No one ever read it, because no one ever thought it applied. Until now. After the meeting, Nathan clapped me on the back like we were buddies. Nothing personal, Quinn. We just gotta evolve, right? I smiled. Not fake, not angry, just tired. You're right, I said. We do. He chuckled. Hey, if you ever want to help onboard the new guy when we bring him in, I'll think about it, I said, sipping the last of my coffee. He walked off to his next power lunch. Probably thought he'd won something. I stayed behind, let the room clear out, then pulled out the slim black folder I kept at the bottom of my laptop sleeve. Inside, the original funding agreement. A notarized letter from Granite Arc's legal counsel affirming my ownership. A printout of the bylaws they never bothered to update. I looked at the signature page. I hadn't touched it in years. But today it felt warm again. Like it remembered me. That night, I didn't rant to anyone. I just reheated leftovers, sat on the back porch, watched the breeze shift the branches just enough to remind me the season was changing. Lena used to love this time of year. I could almost hear her voice again. They're going to forget who you are, Quinn. So make sure the paperwork remembers. She was right, and it was time. Before I go, deeper drop your city in the comments, like and subscribe, because what happened after that meeting? Let's just say Nathan didn't realize he'd just made his last big decision. And the board, they were about to meet the shareholder they forgot they had. But not through confrontation, through compliance. And Clause 7.2, they didn't even wait a full week. By Tuesday, a Slack message landed from Nathan's executive assistant, team transition meeting, Thursday at 9 a.m. Please confirm attendance. Riley T. to shadow Quinn for Q4 succession. No subject line, no explanation. Just a casual appointment stuffed between DevOps review and fall product tour kickoff. I stared at the calendar notification longer than I needed to. They weren't even trying to be subtle. Riley Tran. I'd seen him around a sharp kid with the kind of startup swagger that impresses people who've never touched back-end code in production. I had nothing against him, except apparently he was here to replace me. No one had said the word out loud, but in corporate we don't always fire you. We just reroute around you. I didn't delete the message. I didn't reply either. I just walked out of my office down to the second floor archive room, punched in the same 4-digit code I'd used since 2016. It still worked. The storage lights flickered on, humming like they remembered me. On the third shelf behind an unopened Helixion 2019 holiday mug was a fireproof envelope. Inside my original funding agreement, countersigned by Trevor Langford, when he still thought I was just a sentimental engineer trying to support the company. I turned to page 6. There it was. Clause 7.2. Activation of latent controlling interest in the event of hostile structural displacement. Written in clean language buried in a quiet paragraph. No buzzwords, no flags. Just power in waiting. Lena had insisted we phrase it that way. Make sure the paperwork remembers she said. I sat on the floor and let the paper rest across my knees. I hadn't touched it in years. Part of me had hoped I'd never have to. But here we were. Nathan was moving quickly now. By Thursday, Riley was in my morning stand-up pretending to take notes while Nathan asked increasingly irrelevant, future-focused questions. Quinn, how much of our current integration pipeline is hard-coded around your personal systems? Would you say any of your legacy access makes onboarding difficult for younger hires? Do you think it would be helpful for Riley to start managing some external vendor relationships directly just for visibility? Trevor nodded along. I doubt he even realized what he was co-signing. Or maybe he did. Maybe I was a convenience in a crisis, and now I was just friction in a growth story. The best part, they thought I was frozen, that I didn't know what was happening. But the truth is I had made my decision the moment I saw the name on that meeting invite. I went home that night and found the USB Lena used to keep her photos on. Inside in a folder named Sunflower was the notarized document linking Granite Arc LLC to her estate. I had signed the transfer paperwork months after the cancer diagnosis, but never disclosed it publicly. Lena had trusted me to use it, only if the company forgot why I stayed. It had. So I stopped arguing. I stopped emailing recaps. I stopped defending my value in meetings. I let them believe they were getting ahead. Because the moment they finalized my succession, Clause 7.2 would execute automatically, and Helixion would discover something interesting about who actually held controlling voting rights on the board. By the time Riley was invited to join the strategic planning session for FY 26, I'd already begun Phase 1. No one noticed that the Granite Arc ownership login had been refreshed. No one checked which law firm was quietly requesting a new cap table review. And no one, not even Nathan, knew that the old engineer they were trying to erase had just stepped into the center of the boardroom. Not by title, by ownership. Let them keep smiling. Let them keep scheduling. They were walking into a meeting where they'd finally get what they wanted, except this time, I'd be sitting across from them. And I wouldn't be leaving. The next meeting invite wouldn't come from Nathan. It would come from the firm representing Granite Arc. And the subject line, Board Realignment Proposal, Immediate Action Required. I didn't need to rush. That was the beauty of it. By the time Nathan invited Riley to his second visibility meeting with the senior LPS team, the shift had already begun. Not in the way they thought PowerPoint's transition plans whispered succession lines, but in a set of scanned PDFs I'd emailed to my trust attorney 3 days earlier. They didn't even notice that I'd moved the last voting block into Granite Arc's operating ledger. The final 3.2% had been held through an outdated convertible note agreement from the 2020 restructuring. No one had remembered it existed, except Lena and me. I'd signed the original agreement with a clause she added herself, handwritten and notarized. Any forced role reassignment or strategic removal of Quinn Harris without performance-based review shall trigger full voting realignment to the holder of Silent Interest Class A. In short, if they tried to erase me without cause, I became the majority again. And they were already erasing me, publicly, proudly. Nathan's mistake wasn't that he underestimated me, it was that he documented it. That morning, he posted a Slack update after the board prep call. Riley will be front-facing with strategy next quarter. Expect Quinn to step back into a legacy handover role by January. He'll still consult on ops until then. The phrasing was surgical. Legacy handover, still consult. Polite euthanasia. But it triggered the clause. By 10:43 a.m., Granite Arc's compliance attorney, Linda Chen, had sent a single-line email to the Helixion General Counsel. Notice of voting realignment under Silent Interest Class A clause. Reference contract ID, HXQ 2020 RT. I was CC'd. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked into the Wednesday metrics review like nothing had changed. Nathan was running it now, flanked by Riley. The kids still called me Sir. They reviewed quarterlies, proposed a new vendor alignment I'd vetoed months ago, and cheerfully ignored me when I raised a concern about customer attrition in the B2B mid-market segment. It didn't matter. Because upstairs, Trevor Langford, the same CEO who once shook my hand and thanked me for wiring my family's inheritance to keep Heliction solvent, was just realizing something. That the man they'd planned to sunset was now legally and irrevocably the majority vote on every executive decision they wanted to make. And he hadn't told Nathan. I'd watched this before, not in a corporate boardroom, but in my father's construction firm back in Ohio. A young foreman had tried to push my dad out of his own crew, thinking the older man was too slow, too analog. My dad let him run the site for 3 weeks until the inspection board showed up. Every corner cut, every invoice misfiled, every shortcut documented. The foreman stood silent while my father read the code violations out loud. He never raised his voice, just handed over the clipboard and said, "This is still mine." That memory came back as I watched Nathan stumble through his projections, using language that didn't even match our current compliance commitments. We'll sunset legacy contracts with Tier 2 suppliers to streamline onboarding velocity. That's not how any of this worked, but sure, keep talking. I almost laughed. I wasn't angry anymore. That had burned off the moment I saw Linda's subject line. What replaced it was colder, sharper, like stepping into a clean room, sterile, focused. I wasn't going to fight them. I was just going to let them document their own irrelevance. Let them make one more decision without me. Let them commit it to record. Let them send the next board memo without my approval. And then I'd use it. The transfer protocol in our shareholder agreement didn't just shift votes. It required automatic review of all C-level compensation and executive strategic decisions, and new equity allocation. Every deal Nathan made would now require my sign-off. He just didn't know it yet. And Trevor, he was too busy managing investor optics to ask the right question. But someone would. Someone on the board would notice the timestamp. And they'd wonder why I was so quiet. They'd ask why I hadn't objected or pushed back or filed anything formal. And then they'd see the truth. That I hadn't stepped back. I had simply let go of the mask. Let them speak. Let them move. Let them believe. Until the next calendar invite arrived. Sent from Granite Arc LLC. Subject line, emergency special session, executive realignment proposal. Because if you let a man believe he's in control long enough, he'll walk himself straight into the vote that removes him. I was halfway through an espresso in the executive lounge when I saw it. A Slack ping from Trevor Langford, new org chart goes out Friday, time to streamline. That word again, streamline. It always meant two things: someone was getting pushed out and someone else was about to smile like they earned it. Nathan had been in the CEO's office every other afternoon that week. Glass door closed, lights low, voices muffled. That meant one of two things. Either Trevor was grooming him for the public pivot, or Nathan had finally convinced him I was dead weight. Not that it mattered. The moment I saw that message, I quietly opened a folder on my desktop titled Granite Arc, Execution Notes. Inside were 4 documents. 1. The original convertible note agreement. 2. The updated clause schedule. 3. The internal voting ledger. 4. And the formal request template to trigger a controlling interest decision without full board consent. The last one hadn't been opened in 5 years, not since Lena and I built it for emergency succession planning. The irony, of course, was that Trevor had signed off on it. I didn't click it, not yet. Instead, I poured another espresso and waited. The next morning, I got CC'd on a calendar invite titled Q3 Realignment, Strategic Direction, sent by Nathan, not Trevor. No explanation, just a time, a Zoom link, and a 6-slide agenda. I skimmed the agenda twice. The last line stopped me cold. 6 executive transitions, legacy advisory role proposal. They were moving me, quietly, probably into some consultant status with no voting authority. Strip the power, give me a plaque, let Nathan make a LinkedIn announcement while I faded into trusted emeritus status. They didn't realize the trap had already locked months ago. Let me back up. When Granite Arc Holdings was established during the company's crisis era, we'd intentionally buried the voting trigger clause deep in the 3rd schedule attachment of the funding memo. It stated that in the event of executive leadership restructuring any shareholder exceeding 50% ownership via silent entity or proxy, could call a binding vote on leadership reassignment before the change was ratified. But it only activated if the restructuring was proposed, not confirmed. That was the difference. That's what Nathan didn't understand. The moment he made it formal by sending that invite and listing me as a transition, he gave me the legal window I needed. It was all time-stamped, documented, and best of all, his own Slack thread sealed it. Trevor called me late that evening. Quinn, he said, in that tone that managers use when they're trying to sound friendly but firm. I know this feels sudden, but you've earned the right to step back with grace. Nathan's ready to lead, and frankly, the board is hungry for energy. Energy, I said, repeating it like a wine tasting note. You'll still have full benefits, he continued. An advisory title, your name on the building. My name's not the part that matters, I replied, but I appreciate the call. I think that's when something flickered in his voice, a beat of hesitation. You've been good to this company, Quinn. I hope you'll trust me to carry that forward. I didn't respond. I just ended the call with a soft, take care, Trevor. Then I opened the fourth document, the formal request template, and I copied one line of text from Trevor's Slack thread into the justification field. Time to streamline. Because once that word was used in the context of executive role transition, it fulfilled every legal requirement to trigger the shareholder reassignment clause. And because Granite Arc held a controlling 51%, Trevor's voice wouldn't carry weight at the board meeting unless I invited it. I didn't submit it yet. I saved the file and closed the folder. Why? Because I wanted to see what Nathan would say to me directly. Would he gloat? Would he fake concern? Would he play humble visionary? The answer came the next day. He stopped by my office, leaned on the doorframe with that casual confidence only people who've never been told no can pull off. You know, he said, when I was a kid, I used to think a legacy meant keeping what worked. But now, I realize it's about building on what came before, evolving it. I said nothing. He waited a beat, then smiled. We'll make sure your seat stays warm. I mean that. That was the moment I knew he'd never see it coming. I nodded, stood, and extended my hand. He shook it, and for just a second, I think he thought he'd won. That night I sent the file to Linda Chen. Subject line, trigger. Clause, execution, voting reassignment, schedule, 3.B.4. Within 24 hours, Granite Arc Holdings would submit a private board vote notice to the compliance registrar. Trevor wouldn't be notified until the vote was complete, because sometimes silence is the only noise that matters. And sometimes legacy isn't something you hand off. It's something you defend. In 3 days, the board would gather for a vote Trevor didn't schedule. And Nathan, he was already planning his acceptance speech. I was sitting across from Nathan in the quarterly strategy sync when I saw it flash across his face. That smug little nod like a dog that just pissed on your rug and dared you to notice. The slide behind him had my project listed under Legacy Archive. Not discontinued, not repurposed, just retired. Funny thing is, I hadn't seen the approval go through. Nathan clicked to the next slide. Budget reallocations. My line items were gone. Then came the title shift, my name missing entirely from the proposed leadership org chart. The kill shot wasn't loud. It was a bullet in a conference deck wrapped in formatting. Any comments, he asked, turning to the room like he was offering us all a sip from his poisoned well. I smiled, just once. Then I opened my laptop, navigated to the secure node on the Granite Arc server, and triggered the Watcher Clause. Clause 14.2, Shareholder Notification Protocol, enacted upon removal of strategic project owner without board consultation. Signed 2 years ago, buried under the Capital Restructuring Addendum. Trevor and I negotiated back when we still trusted each other. It wasn't flashy, just a clause, but it had teeth. I remember writing it. It was the night after Trevor made me stay late cleaning up his failed API demo before the board meeting. I stayed till 2 a.m. that night, watching the city rain hit the parking lot lights. And I knew then, if he'd ever sell me out, I'd need a trigger he wouldn't notice until it was too late. Granite Arc Holdings held the master seat, but Quinn Harris held the alarm. The protocol sent a silent alert to our legal trust firm, Kessler and Bright. Within 36 hours, the board would receive a request for review of unauthorized restructuring, and if the review wasn't honored, Granite Arc could pause the executive voting rights of any individual associated with the removal. Nathan had no clue. He was still explaining how cross-functional agility required new leadership when Trevor walked in, late-looking flustered. No handshake, no eye contact. I watched Trevor glance at the slide deck. He didn't say anything, but his eyes flicked to me, and I swear for the first time in 10 years, I saw something in him that wasn't arrogance. I saw worry. I closed the laptop gently. He knew, not the full shape of it, but enough. You don't sign a clause like 14.2 and forget the ink. By that evening, Kessler and Bright had acknowledged receipt. Formal board review scheduled for Monday. Nathan's new leadership plan would have to be frozen until review. and any asset associated with Legacy Archive was now marked under protective governance. Translation: he couldn't move budget, couldn't reassign headcount, couldn't present new titles, not without triggering secondary compliance flags. The trap wasn't loud. It wasn't a kill switch. It was a leash, one they walked straight into. Trevor sent me a Slack message later that night. Wasn't expecting 14.2 to be enforced. Can we talk? I didn't answer, because this wasn't about talking. This was about remembering who I was when we built this company. Before they started calling me Legacy. Before Nathan said I was replaceable. I walked the office floor once before heading home. The janitor was buffing the lobby tiles, humming some old Springsteen track. I passed the etched logo near the elevators. Halden Row. Soon there would be a review of how much of that name actually held voting weight. Because when Granite Arc took majority voting power in 2020, they assumed the structure was just for legal shielding. What Trevor never bothered to ask was who owned Granite Arc Holdings by the time that clause went live. Let's just say it was no longer him. And Nathan, he was walking into a room where he thought he was king. He hadn't even realized the chair he sat in was mine. I didn't want revenge at first. I really didn't. I wanted partnership, legacy, continuity. But some lessons only stick when the system teaches them back. And Monday's meeting was gonna be one hell of a teacher. If you've ever had to sit quietly while someone tried to write you out of your own story, hit like and subscribe. You're not alone in that silence. And trust me, sometimes the quietest ones write the loudest clauses. Monday's meeting wasn't just about review. It was about reminding the board who they had really signed with. And Nathan, he was about to learn the difference between leadership and ownership. I walked into the Monday morning board meeting without a briefcase, without a laptop, without a word. Nathan was already seated at the head wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my old Camry, flipping through pages he didn't understand. His tie was slightly crooked. Trevor stood near the wall, arms folded, glaring at me like I'd missed a cue in a play he thought he was directing. Quinn, Nathan said, coolly tapping a folder. Appreciate you making it on time this morning. As you've probably heard, we've decided to expedite some internal restructuring. You'll be staying on through the end of the quarter, just in a slightly rescoped advisory role. He looked around for approval. A few directors nodded faintly. One glanced down at their tablet. No one smiled. I pulled out the chair directly across from Nathan. Same chair I used to sit in back when Trevor still called me his rock. I'll need this in writing, I said. Trevor scoffed from the wall. We'll have legal draw something up this week. I kept my hands folded. No, I said, voice steady. I meant I'll need this meeting, and every decision made today entered into the board minutes, including the fact that clause 14.2 has been triggered. Nathan blinked. Sorry, what clause? Trevor straightened. That clause was deactivated when the recapitalization event closed. It doesn't apply. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean in. It applies, I said. Granite Arc Holdings owns 51.4% of voting shares as of last month. The recap event was contingent on unanimous board ratification, which never occurred. I've confirmed with corporate counsel. Clause 418.2 stands. Trevor's lips tightened. He turned sharply to the in-house counsel sitting 2 seats down. Is this true? The young lawyer Jacob hesitated, then slowly nodded. It appears the clause was never formally nullified, sir, which means Mr. Harris has authority to call for a voting hold and request an operational freeze under emergency override. Nathan laughed too loud and too fast. Are you joking? This guy's been hiding in the server room for a decade, and now suddenly he's our shadow puppet master. He looked around again. This time no one nodded. I let the silence stretch. For 9 years, they hadn't asked where the money came from. For 9 years, I let Trevor play the patriarch while I repaired the engine underneath him. And now they had to ask why the engine stopped humming. I don't need you to like it, I said quietly, just to respect the contract you all signed. Trevor moved toward me, but something in his eyes faltered. Not rage recognition. He remembered the night in that little airport Marriott when I'd handed over a personal check to save the company. He remembered the clause. He just never thought I'd enforce it. Why now, he muttered. I looked at him, really looked. The man who used to mentor me, who used to say things like, "Stick with me, Quinn. I'll make sure they never forget your name." Now he couldn't even say it without gritting his teeth. Because I finally understood something I said. Silence doesn't mean surrender. It just means you're still calculating. I didn't bring up the fundraiser. I didn't bring up the speech he gave last quarter, crediting Nathan for stabilizing our international revenue streams numbers I secured through 12 months of back-channel audits. I didn't need to, because this time I wasn't trying to prove anything. Across the table, Nathan looked like he wanted to throw a chair. You can't just freeze operations. I haven't, I replied. I've requested a formal audit review, which per clause 14.2 suspends your authority to restructure personnel until the review is complete. Nathan laughed again, but the room had already shifted. Directors were flipping pages. Jacob was tapping on his tablet. The power dynamic had changed, and he was the last to feel it. And for the first time, Trevor didn't speak. He just sat down slowly like someone who'd realized they'd misread a map they wrote themselves. A year ago, I would have felt vindicated. Now I just felt relieved, like I'd finally stopped pretending to owe these men my silence. I stood. I'll have the full request delivered by noon. Until then, I suggest no one reassigns anything they can't undo. Before I reached the door, Trevor's voice finally broke through. You're not the man I thought you were. I paused. No, I said, I'm not the man you trained me to be. And then I left, but I didn't go back to my office. I went to the archive vault. To find the one folder they all forgot existed the one I'd filed under contingency when this company still had a soul. You want to know what was inside? That's where the real reckoning began. By the time Q4 planning began, Brent had rerouted every major infrastructure initiative I'd launched. The energy modeling tool I'd built with Monroe Labs, scrapped. The vendor migration timeline I'd personally negotiated to avoid Q1 licensing penalties, rewritten under a different name with worse terms. I didn't respond, not directly. I watched. Every file he touched, every task he reassigned to Connor, they all had one thing in common. He was trying to erase me, quietly, like a bad draft. Not with confrontation, but with revision. But here's what he didn't know, I was already 2 versions ahead. Weeks earlier, I'd begun prepping for something else. A corporate filing, standard shelf corp structure, Delaware registration, all under an entity name so bland even the IRS would yawn. QH Strategic Holdings. Quiet on purpose. Because while Brent and the board were laser-focused on performance KPIs and internal attrition charts, I was studying ownership distributions. And ownership, that's where the real org chart lives. Most people forget that once you're above a certain pay grade, titles don't protect you, clauses do. And Brent, he never read the funding documents from the Series D round. Never asked where the emergency bridge capital in 2017 came from. The one that saved the company after the Halvix pipeline disruption nearly bankrupted us. That capital came from one person, and she never asked for a seat on the board, just one line in the term sheet. I was 17 when my grandmother sold the last of her farmland outside Helena. I asked her once if she missed it. She smiled and said, I didn't lose anything. I traded it for your future. It wasn't until I was standing in the cold lobby of Solterra Bank last month, confirming that her capital transfer had legally converted into preferred equity under a silent trust, that I finally understood what she meant. Trevor once told me, quiet power is the only power that lasts. Everything else is just noise. I finally believed him. So, when Connor forwarded me yet another updated infrastructure strategy doc, one that used my original roadmap but stripped out every last mention of me, I smiled. Because the man rewriting my playbook was doing it under a license I now owned. I still hadn't said a word, not to legal, not to HR, not even to Trevor. But behind the scenes, Diana Keller's team at Bellmark had quietly secured confirmation from the registrar's office, with the trust conversion finalized. QH Strategic Holdings now controlled 52% of the company's voting rights. Let that sink in. Brent had spent the past 5 months systematically trying to push me out, while working under the ownership of the man he called dead weight. That's what made it poetic. He didn't lose because I fought back. He lost because he never looked up. So, I walked into the executive check-in that Monday morning like I was still invisible. Polite nods, legal pad in hand. I let him speak first. Look, Brent said, motioning to the org chart on the wall. We're simplifying reporting lines. You'll technically still be an infrastructure, but we're reallocating decision authority upstream. Reallocating, I repeated, my voice calm. Purely strategic. You'll still be looped in on core initiatives, of course. Of course. It was the same script he'd used with Trevor, and Monroe, and Ashley, and every other senior leader who left or faded into middle-tier ambiguity over the last year. But I wasn't fading, because in 24 hours, the board would receive a legal disclosure packet from Keller's office informing them of a shift in controlling interest. No drama, no leaks, just compliance. And the moment Brent tried to spin it, he'd have to explain how he allowed a non-core advisor to quietly become the company's majority shareholder, while he was busy reorganizing department roles like a game of musical chairs. Before I walked out of that meeting, he glanced at my pad. "You didn't take any notes." "No," I said, standing. I didn't need to. There was no point. Because the org chart was already outdated. Brent always assumed chaos was a result of bad people making bad choices. He never understood that sometimes it just takes the right pressure applied at the exact wrong time. That I didn't have to lift a finger. The first crack came during a quarterly call with Calvix Partners. A compliance analyst, nervous maybe too junior to understand the politics, asked why our vendor transition logs didn't match the Q2 expenditures. Brent laughed it off, said something about speed over paperwork. But the moment he dropped that line, I knew the fuse had been lit. The board's general counsel was on that call, quiet, not taking notes, just listening. And 2 hours later, Diana Keller, head of internal audit, had her team send out a preservation notice. All logs, emails, and invoice trails going back 12 months. Subject urgent, financial record freeze. I'd seen that subject line once before, back when a director at my last firm tried to expense a ski condo as client development. I didn't need to be in the room when Brent read it. I could feel it through the silence that followed. For once, his Slack status didn't change. No joke messages, no pings, just offline. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I had my next call with Trevor and Vanessa from Ops. Purely routine, except they were suddenly respectful, not deferential, just awake. Like they realized they'd missed something fundamental. I mentioned a clause in our Series F investment agreement, one Brent had probably never even read. A clause I helped write. It tied performance metrics to capital release schedules and included a trigger for external audit if discrepancies exceeded 7.5% across 2 quarters. Vanessa blinked. Trevor muttered, "Wait, seriously." I didn't answer, just let them sit with it. He spent months rerouting my projects while working under the ownership of the man he called dead weight. That line stuck in my head as I watched a short clip from an industry roundtable Brent had attended the week before. He was bragging red-faced calling innovation a vibe and mocking older engineers as legacy ghosts. Legacy. That word always sat heavy with me. My grandmother once called our inheritance a debt we owe the future. I used to think she meant money. I don't anymore. The next morning, someone forwarded me a memo. It had been leaked anonymously, but it was clearly from Diana. Internal concerns. Investigatory request. Line item CEO Brent Langford's discretionary spending under review. There it was, not public yet, but it would be. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, just a grainy black and white shot of my grandmother in front of her storefront. Harris Books, 1974. She used to hand stamp each receipt with the line, "Thank you for supporting something that matters." I used to think I needed Brent to see me. Now I realized that he couldn't even see himself falling. And I wasn't going to stop him. Not yet. The board was about to call an emergency session. Diana had just requested independent counsel. And Brent. He was still clinging to a version of the org chart that didn't exist anymore. He had no idea who really signed the checks now, or who held the debt covenants. But he would soon, because the next phase, that wasn't about emails or board meetings anymore. That was going to happen in front of a camera, in public, at the annual Shareholders Summit. And I had just submitted my name to speak. Brent didn't unravel all at once. It was slower than that. Like a house settling little creaks, shifting weight hairline fractures in the drywall, no one notices until the ceiling sags. First came the investor call. I wasn't in it. Didn't need to be. I had a copy of the transcript before the end of the day. Someone I suspect Diana Keller asked directly why the board hadn't been notified of the Series F clause conversion 6 months earlier. Brent fumbled through something about streamlined cap table oversight and executive simplification initiatives. The kind of over-polished nonsense that sounds fine until you realize he never actually answered the question. Then came the clause itself. I'd written it with Graham, our former CEO, during a desperate December round 2 years back. Quiet capital to avoid layoffs. The board knew. Legal knew. It was buried in the footnotes of the footnotes, but it was real. And Brent had signed a performance-based vesting addendum on his C-suite compensation plan, tied to equity majority stability. Guess who the equity majority wasn't anymore? I didn't say anything publicly. No need. The board hired a third-party firm to conduct an executive compliance review. Diana didn't look at me when she announced it in the Monday meeting. She didn't have to. Brent looked at me. That was the first time I saw it, real fear, not panic, not anger, just the slow dawning of truth on someone who's lived too long on entitlement. He didn't yell, didn't posture. He just said, "Let's talk offline." We didn't, because by Thursday, Altair Partners, one of our largest logistics vendors, paused all expansion contracts pending leadership stabilization. And that more than anything shook the board. Altair had stuck with us through a global downturn. Brent's whole pitch was expansion through strategic vendor synergy. And now the synergy wanted off the ride. He called me that night. "Quinn, I know we haven't always," he started. I didn't let him finish. "You called me Replaceable Brent. Remember that I do, every day." I didn't yell. I just let it hang there. Let him sit with the memory of that moment, him smug in the boardroom thinking he was invincible. He exhaled. A sound I'd heard him make once before when we had to let 80 people go during the pandemic. And he didn't want to sign the press statement. "Are you trying to tank this company?" he finally asked. "No," I said. "I'm trying to protect it." That silence. It felt like justice. But I'll admit there was still a weight in my chest. Not triumph. Something quieter, sadder. He'd been arrogant, sure, but he'd also been a part of the company's growth. Somewhere under the ego, he had talent, just not the kind that survives unchecked power. That Friday, the board held an emergency session. I didn't attend. I went home early, opened the old tin box where I'd kept my grandmother's first investment letter, the one she mailed me in college with the check that started all this. "Ownership," she wrote, "isn't a spotlight. It's a shadow. You use it to block harm, not steal light." I'd forgotten that until that night. The next morning, Diana sent a single-line email, "Expect a new proposal, Monday. Be ready." And that's when I realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. 2 weeks after the quarterly earnings call my name showed up in a place I never expected to see it again, on a board memo. It was forwarded to me by a junior legal assistant at Westridge. The subject line was sterile, but the first sentence made my chest tighten. "Pending board consensus, we would like to discuss a formal proposal to reinstate Quinn Harris as strategic advisor and offer retroactive equity conversion at original vesting terms." Strategic advisor, vesting terms, retroactive compensation. In plain English, they wanted me back. The memo was signed by two names, Dorian Vale and Graham Langston, the man who once said I was replaceable and the man who replaced me. Attached to the bottom of the PDF was a scan of an official letter on Helixion letterhead. One paragraph jumped out. "We acknowledge the oversights in both communication and recognition of Mr. Harris's legacy contributions. We believe reintegration would serve the best interests of Helixion's continuity and public trust." Public trust. It wasn't about closure, it was about the optics. They were hemorrhaging contracts. Investors had started asking questions about licensing continuity ownership. Someone must have traced the core survival capital from the 2018 bailout and found Quinn Holdings. They didn't want to apologize. They wanted to plug a leak. I stared at the screen for 10 full minutes before I moved, not from shock, from stillness. The kind that comes when you've already lived the worst of it and found peace. The younger version of me might have printed that offer and taped it to his mirror, proof he mattered. Now I just felt clean. That night, I walked out to the small garden behind my house, the one I planted after stepping down. I sat under the old wisteria vine that bloomed late every spring, even after the frost had its way with it. It reminded me of something my grandmother once said about plants and people. Things that grow in silence stay rooted longer. I pulled out the original contract copy. I kept the one I'd folded into my sketchbook the day I wired the money. The signatures were still there. Mine, Marcus Chen's, even the notary stamp. They'd never bothered to read the fine print about Class C silent equity conversion. I hadn't needed a lawyer, just time. What I wanted back then could have been fixed with a title. What I want now can't. I didn't respond to the memo. But the next morning, a revised shareholder statement was released to the press. For the first time, Quinn Holdings appeared publicly on the filing. My name was still buried, but not for long, because the final board vote was coming, and I wouldn't be walking in as strategic advisor. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the room was when I entered. No greetings, no coughs, just the soft clicking of laptop keys as they pretended not to be staring. Dorian Vale was already seated posture upright, a legal pad perfectly aligned in front of him. Graham Langston glanced up then back down, like my presence physically irritated him, but he couldn't move me this time, because this wasn't his meeting. The shareholder vote had been called by the compliance committee triggered automatically once the ownership threshold surpassed 51%, and a strategic ethics clause buried in the 2016 funding restructure was activated. The clause required an internal governance review if a conflict of interest arose involving an executive and their immediate family during active acquisition phases. Graham never thought anyone would trigger it, but he didn't read the footnotes. I did. Beside me sat Valerie Chen, interim counsel from the Langford Advisory Group. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence, much like the updated register of silent Class B shareholders that I had helped consolidate over 2 years, said enough. It was never about controlling the boardroom with volume. It was about controlling the vote. Graham cleared his throat and launched into some rehearsed monologue about loyalty, tenure, legacy, vision. His voice was calm, but his palms were sweating tiny half-moons on his note cards. Every time he said fiduciary duty, someone on the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Then Dorian stood. He didn't raise his voice either. He just laid a printed copy of the compliance breach memo on the table. It listed 6 specific transactions timed within days of personal asset purchases by Graham's daughter, all routed through a shell vendor, all now frozen pending review. One line from Dorian stopped the room cold. You've built a career on forgetting who was in the room when decisions were made. But we remember now. That was the shift. Not a bang, not a gavel. Just silence, then motion. Vote cards lifted, one by one. When it reached me, I didn't hesitate. I flipped my card not out of vengeance, but clarity. Across from me, Graham looked up for the first time. Really looked, not at a name tag, not at a personnel file, at me. I saw it land in his eyes, not fear, not anger, recognition. That's when I knew. I didn't need to take anything else from him. He'd already lost what mattered. The trust, the illusion of control, the story he told himself about who mattered and who didn't. Later, when I walked out of the building, someone from legal held the door. Another nodded. Small things. But they were different now. Not because I won. Because they finally knew I'd been there all along. The garden I used to tend after hours. It had overgrown by now. Wild with the summer rain. But I let it be. It didn't need pruning. It didn't need to prove itself. It just needed space. The same thing I'd needed all along. And in the distance, I could feel what was coming next. But not yet. First, I had one more thing to say. 3 months later, I sat in the same building I once walked through invisible. But this time, no one dared call me replaceable. I didn't take a corner office. I didn't ask for a title. Diana offered one chairman emeritus, she called it. I declined. I told her I preferred the same access I've always had. Quiet, unobstructed, permanent. Graham Vale's name disappeared from the site in less than a week. His resignation letter, sanitized for the press, said to pursue personal passions. But internally, the board vote was unanimous. I didn't even have to raise my hand. My name on the ledger was louder than any voice in that room. Kendra never came back after the deposition. HR said she cleared her desk at midnight, left behind a plaque on her door that read, "Innovation starts with confidence." It was face down in the trash the next morning. Funny thing, no one ever asked how I got to 51%. No one traced the shell acquisitions. No one connected the trust funds or the silent investor swaps. Because they never thought to look. I didn't shout. I documented. There's a quiet power in watching men who mocked you make small talk in elevators they used to command. They nod now. Avoid eye contact. One of them called me Mr. Harris last week. I almost laughed. But I didn't win for the recognition. I won because I proved the one thing I needed to know. I never needed them to believe in me. I just needed to stop believing them. The ledger is still in my drawer. The same one Graham scribbled my shares onto years ago, thinking it meant nothing. A favor to a friend. A placeholder. It's yellowed now, wrinkled at the edges. But the name Quinn Harris is still there, ink-faded authority permanent. People say revenge is loud, that it explodes, burns, screams. Mine whispered, and it stayed. Maybe you've been called replaceable too by someone who forgot how hard you fought to stay, how long you've held the walls up without anyone noticing. Share your own experiences. Like, subscribe for more stories like this one.